Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hope at Work podcast. With me today is Lindsay Kaplan, and she is actually the founder and lead consultant at the Gathering Effect. And she probably has the most interesting background of anybody I've had on the podcast. So I'm going to let her tell you about it. Lindsay?
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks for having me. And what a setup that is. Yes, my name is Lindsay Kaplan. I'm the founder of a consulting firm called The Gathering Effect. And as Marcus alluded to, my background is maybe a little unique. I'll start with what I do today, and that will explain where I came from. I essentially help companies design experiences and strategies that move people to act. And a lot of that looks like designing or redesigning leadership programs, learning experiences, town halls, offsites, onboardings. Anytime you want to influence or change behavior at scale and move people in that way, that's really my specialty. And my background is a mix of three things. I have a master's in organizational psychology. I spent many years in internal learning and development roles at many high growth startups and large firms. And then I also started my career a long time ago in Hollywood, and I worked in television. I wanted to be a comedy writer, and that's how I started things. And so I'm happy to share more about that, but that's probably the outlier there.
It is. I've not met that many people that have worked in Hollywood. What were some of the shows that you wrote for?
Oh, well, I worked on Malcolm in the Middle for a little while. I worked on Curb Your Enthusiasm, a little bit on The Amazing Race. And I worked for a while for a management firm that helped represent writers and directors who were trying to get their pieces sold. So, it was an interesting experience. It was very eye-opening and fun.
I'll bet. So how did you go from doing that type of work to deciding, I want to go back to school, I want to study psychology, I want to help people create more compelling ways of communication in the workplace? That's a bit of a stretch for me.
Yeah, it didn't happen overnight. They often say it makes sense looking backwards. I think that's true for me. I actually was almost a social psychology minor in college, and I decided I didn't want to do that because there was too much science involved. So I actually stopped. But, when I left Los Angeles and left Hollywood, I had no idea what I was going to do next. I was really focused on that singular dream of writing for TV, but it wasn't fulfilling me. I was quite impatient, and I randomly found my way into the training department at DreamWorks Animation. So it was still in film, but adjacent work. And I discovered there that I really enjoyed developing people in real life instead of characters on a page. And there's similar skills, which we can talk about, that help you sort of script learning experiences versus television shows. And then I was just like, kind of so obsessed with learning how to do this. I wanted to figure out how we can change behavior at scale in larger systems and organizations. And so I went to go get my master's and moved to New York, and that was a great experience. And so, I think learning how people change and what moves people in all these different disciplines has been something that's been really helpful to me in my career now.
So you mentioned there were actually some similar skills, as you put it, that you took from your time in Hollywood to your new role. What are some of those transferable skills that served you well?
Yeah, there's a lot, actually. I'd say at the basic level, just observation and empathy, sort of, not in a creepy way, but just watching people, understanding what makes them tick. More specifically, I'd say a couple of things. One, just understanding motivation, why people change, why they do what they do. When we're developing scripts and characters, we think a lot about a character's journey and who they have to meet and what experiences they have to have and decisions that they make. So, it takes a good understanding of human behavior. So much of designing learning experiences is not just about the content that we share, but why people would be motivated to learn it or do something with it, understanding the people that you're creating this for. And then I'd say structure. Comedy in particular is underneath a lot of, things that we love to watch on TV or stand-up specials, is a strong structure. And similarly, in the work that I do now, so much of creating a great learning experience or gathering or change program has a structure. An example of that would be in comedy, we're taught the rule of threes. So the third thing that you say is the outlier. Like for me, the third thing is I worked in Hollywood. That's kind of weird. In comedy, the third thing breaks the pattern and it makes you laugh because it's unexpected.
Okay.
In my work specifically, the rule of threes comes into play because there's a concept called chunking, where you want to chunk your content into sections, into pieces, sometimes threes, that helps people digest and learn better. So I'd say a lot of different ways it's transferable, but those are a couple.
Okay. I like that. So one of the things that attracted me to your site was this idea of helping organizations with a very specific form of communication. Most of us have heard of all hands calls, right? So I think close to 100% of the listeners of this podcast would agree that they have seen all hands calls done very poorly. So let's talk about that specific kind of method of communication. I know that you obviously have worked with organizations with doing virtual calls, with doing in-person calls, with large audiences, small audiences, and probably workshops and things like that. But let's start with the all hands call because, man, I have seen it done so badly so many times. I've also seen it done pretty well, but never really good. So maybe talk a little bit about your experience in working with organizations, specifically with all hands calls. I'm curious to hear your point of view on this.
Yeah, I'm going to send it back to you in just a second to learn more about why you think they're terrible because, I've been an employee for, inside companies. I've had the experience too, but I want to hear more about why you think they're terrible. Let's just frame why this matters, I think, a little bit for folks. Yes, it's frustrating. And yes, we can feel very disengaged or unmotivated or lose our morale after these calls. They can be a really big lever to engagement and productivity and motivation. And they're expensive, incredibly expensive.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I actually have a calculator on my website.
I saw that.
Well, you can do some scary math maybe and kind of determine the cost of these gatherings and employee time if you want to. And yeah, there's many reasons why they're important to get right. And I think we maybe just think this is about transmitting information, but really they are a chance to move people emotionally and behaviorally. And that takes a different kind of skill, which I can talk more about in a second. But I want to go back to you and learn from you about why you think they're terrible. Because, yeah, tell me.
Well, so again, I've been a part of a lot of different organizations over the years, and some are better than others. The thing that I think bothers me frequently is the authenticity factor or the lack thereof. They tend to be very scripted, and I get that, right? Like you're usually, for the company that I work for today, we have, 17,000 employees, and then our parent company has 130,000. So you want to be prepared and structured and ready. But the scripting and the lack of authenticity that I frequently see makes it feel, again, like they're transmitting to me versus attempting to move me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I think a lot of organizations view it as a download of information. And that is common more so when we don't have other communication channels in our company. So sometimes I work with clients and they say, can you help us, redesign our town hall to fix a specific kind of business problem? And I'll look at the other ways in which they're communicating with their employees, and the town hall or the all hands has become the panacea or the catch-all for every way we need to communicate. And therefore it's one big information dump. And, there's many reasons why that's not very effective, although we think it might be efficient. So I get why that happens, and I have a lot of empathy for the problem. And like I said, we're often not taught, the communication skill, how to share information in a way that actually does get people to want to retain it, remember it, care about it, do something with it. That's why my company is called The Gathering Effect. We do these things to create an effect in other people. And that is, I think, the opportunities to learn how to do that. So I'm happy to share more as sort of what I specifically do with people and some small changes that we can make. But I agree, this is common in companies.
Yeah, it feels like it. Town halls, all hands, lots of different meetings that are that could use some improvement. So very curious to hear kind of how you go about starting to work with an organization, and what some of those recommendations are.
Yeah, I'll walk you through. I said rule of threes earlier. I'm going to practice what I preach. I'm going to tell you the three things I tend to do with folks, and maybe a bonus fourth thing to watch out for. When people come to me, there's three main shifts we tend to work on. The first is to shift from the information I want to share, the topic I'm talking about, to the effect I want it to have. What's the outcome I'm looking for? And this is relevant for not just town halls, trainings, offsites, onboardings. So many of these things can be applied here. So the questions to ask are things like, what do you want people to do with this information? What should they know, learn, be, feel afterward? If I look through a camera lens, what would I see people doing afterwards? Can you tell me a story about the before and after? The more we can elicit what happens afterwards, the more clear we are on what needs to be included and how we should go about sharing it. Specifically, what I guide people to is, what effect are you really after? Do you want compliance? Do you want to simply inform people? Do you want to entertain them? Or do you want to engage them, which means buy-in, ownership, behavior change? And depending on that answer, we can design the all hands or the town hall for the effect that we want. So I'll pause there, but that's the most important step that is often skipped.
That's a great point too. I started in a bit of a critical, kind of way of saying, hey, I like to be entertained. And so the informational piece may be, less valuable to me, but I think you brought something else up early on that I want to point out. And that is, if the town hall or the all hands call, whatever you call it, is the virtually only form of communication, then maybe, either trying to pack too much in, or they're, not leveraging other mediums of communication, that maybe the informational piece could have been sent prior through an email, through SharePoint sites, through, obviously there's a lot of different, other mediums of communication. And I think that has got to be part of your consultative approach too, is helping people determine, what do you want to include in a formal meeting versus what can be sent beforehand or after, or in a different context?
Yeah, we will often do a larger audit of what's the appropriate channel and which one should be pull and which one should be push. I will say I have a lot of empathy for the folks who are making these kinds of decisions, because the mindset is often, well, if I didn't say it, how will they know to do it? Or, well, I have to tell them. I can't send an email. I have to make the best use of this time. And then there's various reasons why we think we should just sort of stuff the suitcase, as I call it, put everything in there, without really realizing that it's wasted time and effort, usually. Specifically, if we're getting everyone together, especially if it's synchronous, that requires, or I think employees want to be more involved and engaged and seen, versus just sort of talked at for an hour because they can read the email about that, or they can watch the broadcast later on. So all of these things feel like kind of small choices, and they are, but they lead into feeling engaged, more motivated, disconnected, all these things, which can make someone shut their laptop for the day and say, I'm not doing any more work. They didn't respect my time. These things matter and they add up.
Yeah. Or maybe they are multitasking while they are listening to the call.
Yeah, which I don't blame folks. I think that's very, very common. It just doesn't have to be that way. And so, after we look at the topic, we go from topic to effect. So we help them make that switch. If we want more engagement, then we need to do a couple of things. We need to pull instead of push, meaning we need to make the town hall with people, not at them. And I can give a couple of ways I tend to coach people to do that if that's helpful.
Please.
So one is to give employees or your audience a role or ownership. We know probably from our organizational development, nerd or fascination, that involvement tends to lead towards commitment with any sort of change that you're trying to create. The same is true here of something like a town hall. So how can you give your employees a role in the town hall? It can be, we're going to share something. Please give us feedback on this. Or as I'm talking today, think through X, Y, and Z. Or giving people a chance to debrief or digest, for a little bit in breakout rooms. Or, we can choose from, do you want to start with topic A or topic B? Hey, employees, what's most pressing to you? Oh, topic A. Okay, we'll start there. All of these things don't require you to necessarily change the content really at all, but you're just making small choices that increase a sense of agency and ownership with employees. And it's really about these conditions that fuel people's sense of care and commitment. Another way to do this is to just switch from topics to questions. So you could decide your entire town hall around the questions that you're going to answer. And your agenda can become not just the topic, but the questions, or the topic becomes the effect. And so, it can pique curiosity to think about, oh, these are the questions we're going to have answered. Or you can devise your entire town hall around a central question. What's the one thing we're going to answer here? And this actually comes from my screenwriter days. A lot of our favorite televisions and movies are framed around the central question that we watch until the end to find out. So
right.
A bunch of different ways to do this, but again, the goal is to pull, not push.
Okay. So quick question, because the one thing that I do see used probably the most frequently is a Q&A session, right? I've seen it where you allow it throughout, the event. And so you might, get something really interesting midstream and be like, hey, let's address that right now. More frequently, it seems it's held till the end, where there's a Q&A session toward the end. What's your point of view on Q&A in these types of meetings?
Hey, it's Libby DeLucian. If you're sick of business advice that sounds cute, but doesn't actually move the needle forward, this one's for you. The Libby DeLucian podcast is where we go one layer deep. No gurus, no glitter, just straight up unfiltered talk about scaling a business, running a household, and holding on to your sanity in the middle of the chaos. If you're the bottleneck in your business or in your own life, I'll show you how to fix it. Simple, tactical, and one layer deep every time. Let's go. Visit libbyd.com and check out our podcast today.
Oh, how long do we have? That could be a whole podcast episode. I think what I tend to see is we push content at people for 45 minutes and then we have a 15-minute Q&A.
Yes. And
really, that only feels personal and relevant to the people who got their questions answered. To the rest of the folks are sitting there being like, I don't know about this. My suggestion, yes, it's important to have a time for questions, but to decide which communication channels or methods are push versus pull, where are the places where you solicit employee feedback or questions? It can't just be in your town hall. What are the avenues that are available to you? And clarify, what kind of questions are right for which kind of situation. But there's a whole argument to be made for helping solicit more questions, because what I tend to see is, why doesn't anyone ask us anything? So like I said, this could be a very long podcast episode. And when we get to the third tip, I'll share kind of a advanced answer to this question. I'll tease you for that. But I tend to hear most from clients, why doesn't anyone ask us any questions? And usually it's because they don't feel safe or comfortable to do so.
Okay. Yeah. Again, great point about just the availability of a wide variety of channels to solicit information prior to the event, during the event, post-event. So that's really good. So what's the third point?
The third point is to work on personalizing versus what I call one size fits all. And so
love it.
We've talked topic to effect, pull instead of push. And now the directive is to personalize instead of one size fits all. Again, if we pull and personalize, we're moving towards engagement versus compliance. Personalization does not mean we are changing the town hall for every single little person, like an Amazon kind of thing. It just means, personalization means that I feel emotionally connected or committed or seen by what is being shared. I feel like it was made for me, not made for anyone. And there's ways to do this at scale, many ways to do this at scale that, again, do not include changing the content. So I'll give you a couple. One of them is to do an after show. So this connects to your question around questions. An after show is something I got the idea from watching a little too much Bravo, where Andy Cohen, the TV host, does after shows, like watch Real Housewives of Orange County, and then we'll do an after show and talk about it more. Same concept applies here. If you have a large town hall, let's say you have 5,000 employees or 17,000 employees, do smaller after shows with groups where people feel the most comfortable. So like your recruiting team, or because people will speak up in the group in which they feel the most comfortable. So, coach or help your leaders to sort of do these smaller after shows, especially with a tricky subject or a more emotionally charged subject later on, to personalize it for that audience. It's similar to a comedian or a performer who does a talk back after a show. I think it's valuable for both sides. And another way to personalize is to do what I call landing the plane. And we go on airplane rides, and there's procedures that we follow when the plane gets ready to land. We put our seatbelts on and we put the tray table up. We need to land the plane in these gatherings, meaning at the end of your town hall, spend a few minutes reminding people of what you talked about. Here's the takeaway. Here's the summary. And then, most importantly, hand it over to them to do some reflection and application. So what stood out to you? How might you apply this? What might get in the way? That's another way of doing a Q&A that gives the organization much more valuable data than rate your satisfaction from a smiley face to a big smiley face. So these don't take too much time. And I think they can, and I've seen them be incredibly impactful long term.
I love it. The after show concept, fantastic. Totally want to try that. And then landing the plane, man, we rarely land the plane in a lot of meetings, right? I mean, a lot of times it's because we run out of time, and it's like, oh crap, we don't have time to land the plane. We're just going to go to the next flight.
Yeah. And we could continue the metaphor in ways in which I can't quite compute right now, but that's not great, because it's really wasted, right? We can't assume people are going to take it forward or do something. We have to help them. We have to sort of, help them feel more connected to it and carry it forward, which requires time. And as adults, if we can teach back what we learned or wrestle with it or talk about it, it's more likely to stay with us, which is what we want engagement to do, which is why we're designing it this way. Yeah. So I don't buy the argument we don't have time. It just means we haven't designed it well enough.
Well said. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I have another specific question for you. I'm looking forward to your response to this one. You have a background in comedy, in writing. And so I'm curious to hear your point of view about the use of comedy in these types of meetings. So I'll go back a ways. Long time ago, I worked for this small consulting firm in Kansas City. It was called Market Sphere. Okay, all one word, Market Sphere. And so we had this big all hands meeting in person, and I was the HR guy, so I had to give like an update on HR stuff. And so before I did all of this, I went to our marketing person and I had her change our logo from Market Sphere to Marcus Sphere. and I didn't tell anybody I was doing this, including the CEO, who was presenting immediately after me. And I got up on stage and I said, you know what? I just love working for this guy because he gives me such freedom and flexibility. In fact, he allowed me to change the name of the company, and I put the logo on the screen. And it just totally lightened the mood of what I had to talk about, which was hard stuff. It's, benefits, it's administration stuff and compensation. And, HR is usually not an easy topic. I'm curious, do you think we should be using more comedy in these types of things or not? Like, what's your point of view? What have you seen work and not work?
I wouldn't be a good organizational psychologist if I didn't say it depends, which is really the answer to everything. Yes, I am a proponent of it. I feel like it's more important to share the science of why I think this is helpful more than yes or no. I think it really does depend on who's doing it and how you're doing it, and if it feels cheesy. But I love what you did. Here's why I love what you did. What's most effective about adding humor and comedy is that we, as the presenter, let's just say, or the person in charge, lowers our status so that employees feel as though we're just like them. Here's what we have in common, which is incredibly effective to open people up to hearing what you then have to say. It's incredibly, incredibly important. It's why comedians do crowd work. If you go and watch people do stand-up comedy, they're doing crowd work to sort of connect with you and then sort of weave in what the audience is saying. And they're trying, there's much more to say there, but I think that can be really, really beneficial to the outcome. Mm-hmm. Another example of that where I've seen it be really effective is to have kind of a sidekick. I don't know if I'd call it a sidekick, but Stephen Colbert has a band that he plays with, and they will often pipe in and talk with him. Or, Conan O'Brien had a sidekick when he did his comedy show, or Dax Shepard on his podcast has Monica Padman. What that does is it's funny, yes, but it also has someone who is the audience's point of view and is acting as the audience proxy or the employee proxy to feel more connected to the host or the person in charge. So practically speaking, what that looks like is having a facilitator or someone who people can see themselves in acting as the quote unquote sidekick to your program or event. So yes, comedy is great, and a little bit of why and how we can sort of tie that in versus like, let's have more jokes.
Yeah. Good point. And that, again, it's a personal preference for me. I mentioned early on, I want the authenticity, and humor for me should be part of that, right? I mean, we can't take life so seriously all the time.
Yeah, it's an interesting point around the authenticity. And obviously I agree with you. A lot of my lessons come from comedy because I'm a nerd about it, but I also think it's very helpful when we think about how to influence people, right? Not just to laugh, but to feel something. And there's an example that's coming to mind. Stephen Colbert, who I really love and respect and admire, he has a late night show. And when he first started it, he does a monologue, right? And he kind of determined it was falling pretty flat. And he realized that what he needed to add was not just telling the day's news, but how he felt about it. And once he made that change, people felt more connected to him and the content. And so the lesson here, I think, for leaders is, tell us about the financials of Q4, but then tell us how you feel about it. Because great. That's why people are there to hear you. They can read the financials on their own.
That's right.
So yeah, there's so much to say here, but it's all with the guide of having or communicating in a way that moves people, right? That's the goal, to influence them in that way.
Yeah, I love it. It's funny, again, I've been around long enough to know that probably the number one challenge I see at just about every organization I've ever worked at is communication.
Yeah.
We're just not very good at it. And I don't know why that is as human beings. But one of the things that I think is going to be really critical in the next few years is what I'll call it change enablement, right? So it's not change management. We're all going to have to adapt to new ways of working. AI is literally going to change everything. I am a firm believer in that. That makes our ability to adapt to this changing environment critical. And that's going to require communication. That means that leadership is going to have to step up their game. I'm curious to hear your point of view on that, especially when it comes to how technology is changing our lives.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I think to your earlier point around the importance of communication, yes, table stakes. I think specifically the gap I'm trying to fill or teach people is that we were maybe taught how to influence one-to-one, but we likely weren't taught how to influence one-to-many. Perhaps we were taught the way to do that is just to share content or transmit information. In my argument, it's not really a content problem, it's an influence problem. It's the way in which we share it, the way in which we structure it, the way in which that actually, again, moves people. And so that's the shift I'm trying to help people make, whether they're presenting or teaching or communicating. It's a skill, and it's a really big skill for change management, change enablement, whatever you want to call it. because all of these events and programs are change programs, all of them. Even if it's a town hall, it's a change program. You want something to be different at the end, it's a change program. Especially in a world where, we can get content on our own, or AI can give us the answer. We're coming to these events, or we're looking to our leaders for something a little bit different, I would say, which involves knowing how to connect with people. So that's, I'm certainly not an expert on AI, but I want to teach the human skill kind of on top of all of this.
Yeah. Well said. So another question relative to the execution of this. Obviously, there's a lot now communicated virtually through Microsoft Teams and Zoom and other channels. And then there's the in-person. What are the differences for you in terms of how you change your approach and how you coach executives virtual versus in person?
It's interesting. I like to say that my work is channel agnostic and content agnostic. It's, easy to blame Zoom or Teams as the problem for why these events are not great. And I think that's not necessarily fair, because there's someone behind the scenes deciding how to use it. I think that's really important. So the motto that I follow actually has more to do with whether it should be synchronous or not versus whether it should be virtual or not. And so do we need to bring people together, or can we just send out an email and have them watch it on their own? And so my motto is pull together, push apart. So if what we want is engagement and buy-in and behavior change and commitment, we should pull people together. And if what we want is simply to inform people or have them comply and check a box, we can do that apart, push apart. So that's more the coaching I give. On the virtual piece, the number one complaint I hear from folks in charge is, why isn't anyone turning on their camera? And well, that's one of the complaints I hear. And there's various reasons for that, I would say. What I like to tell them is they have the same need as the employees that they're speaking to, which is that they want to be seen and they want to be heard. And oftentimes when people understand that both of them have the same need, they're able to think about how they're communicating in a way that, helps both groups see each other. Whether it's more Q&A or whether it's, learning how to communicate in a way where they feel more connected, whatever. I think that's the unlock. I'll pause there. There's more to say about that mindset shift, but that's a common thing I hear.
Okay. I like that. So just a two-part question, just to wrap up our podcast for the day. First and foremost, what advice would you give folks to just start moving toward this idea of motivating people versus informing them? And then second, how can we engage you? I know I went onto your website, you've got a great model, this visual of push and pull and one size fits all versus personalization. I really like it. But so the first part of the question is, any advice that you give us right now? And then second, how can we engage you later on?
Yeah, thanks for noting the model. It's the language I've been talking about in the podcast. There's a visual model there. So happy to share that with folks. Yeah, I'd say the piece of advice, I would say to ask yourself a question, which is, who is your gathering for? Is it for you, or is it for your employees, or, who's it really for? And be honest with yourself, because that determines how we're creating it. More specifically, the advice I give every single client I talk to is that people don't change because of the content that you share. That's not what is fueling motivation or commitment or action. They change, or they're influenced when they feel affected by the content that you share. And that is the opportunity. That's the skill development. That's the work that I do, whether it's a town hall, a training, an offsite, a leadership program. I'll take your content and I'll help you, or I'll build new content that will help people be more affected by it so that you get more bang for your buck and the business outcomes that you're after. So that's the advice, is just to know that the difference there. In terms of how people can find me, thanks for asking. My website is gatheringeffect.com, or I'm on LinkedIn and would love to connect. I have a newsletter I send out every month on how to move a room, how to move people, and would love to stay connected.
That's perfect. Lindsay, thank you for joining us today. I am going to steal shamelessly so many concepts that you provided. I appreciate it, and would love to have you back on the podcast sometime. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Marcus.